The Haunting of Blackthorn Psychiatric Hospital. It was late November when Emily, a young journalist, decided to accept an assignment that would change her life forever. She was tasked with investigating the long-abandoned Blackthorn Psychiatric Hospital, located in the outskirts of her small hometown. The hospital had been closed for over 3 decades after allegations of inhumane treatments and a series of unexplained patient deaths. Some locals whispered about ghosts, but Emily dismissed such notions. She didn't believe in the supernatural. Emily's editor had given her access to the hospital's sealed-off archives, hoping for a juicy story about corruption and malpractice. She was thrilled by the challenge, armed with her flashlight, voice recorder, and notepad. When she arrived, the dilapidated building loomed over her, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes. She pushed open the rusted gate and stepped onto the overgrown path. The air inside the hospital was stale, thick with the scent of decay. Emily's footsteps echoed eerily as she navigated the dimly lit hallways. Her flashlight beam danced over graffiti-covered walls and shattered furniture. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, but she brushed it off as paranoia. The archives were located in the basement. She descended the creaking stairs, her heart pounding in the silence. The basement was colder, the air heavy with dampness. She found the archive room, a small windowless space filled with metal filing cabinets. Dust particles floated in the flashlight beam as Emily began sifting through the files. Among the medical records and reports, one file caught her attention. It belonged to a patient named Margaret Hayes, a woman who had been admitted in 1975. The notes described Margaret as delusional, claiming she heard voices and saw shadows moving in the corners of her room. But what disturbed Emily was the last entry: patient terminated, condition unmanageable. No explanation, no signature. Every day she went into the room, patient felt better, no longer was delusional. No explanation, no signature. Emily recorded her findings and decided to explore further. She found Margaret's room on the 3rd floor. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a small, barren space. The walls were scratched with frantic markings, as if Margaret had clawed at them. A chill ran down Emily's spine when she noticed a phrase etched repeatedly: "They're watching." She turned to leave, but froze. The door, which she had left ajar, was now shut. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic bubbled in her chest as she pounded on the door. Suddenly, she heard faint whispers, too quiet to make out. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadow move across the room. "This is just my mind playing tricks," she whispered, trying to calm herself. But the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were coming from inside her own head. She sank to the floor, clutching her ears. "Stop it!" she screamed. The flashlight died, plunging her into darkness. Emily fumbled for her phone to use its light, but it slipped from her trembling hands. In the pitch-black room, the whispers stopped, replaced by heavy breathing. It wasn't hers. She scrambled to find her phone, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It wasn't her phone. It felt like a ring. She yanked her hand back as if burned, her breathing shallow. The breathing in the room grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the door creaked open, letting in a sliver of moonlight. Emily didn't question it. She bolted, her heart hammering. She ran down the hallways, the sound of footsteps echoing behind her. She didn't dare look back. Reaching the main entrance, she shoved the heavy door open and stumbled outside. She kept running until she reached her car. Only when she was safely inside did she look back. The hospital stood silently in the moonlight, as if mocking her. That night, Emily tried to convince herself it was all in her head. She uploaded her recordings to her laptop, hoping to find some rational explanation. But as she played back the audio from Margaret's room, her blood ran cold. Amidst her own frantic breaths and footsteps, there was another voice, low and guttural, whispering, You can't leave." Emily didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she decided to drop the story and erase the files, but when she opened her laptop, the screen was black. A single message appeared. "They're watching." Emily's body was found weeks later in her apartment. The police ruled it a suicide, citing her growing paranoia as evidence. But those who knew her swore she wasn't the type to take her own life. And the file on Margaret Hayes? It was never found. Whispers of Hawthorne Manor. Rachel always considered herself a skeptic, a firm believer in logic and reason. So when her best friend Lisa dared her to spend a night in the infamous Hawthorne Manor, Rachel laughed it off. The house had been abandoned for decades, known in local lore as a place where people simply vanished. Rachel, however, saw it as an easy way to win a bet. The manor stood on the edge of a dense forest, its once grand structure now crumbling. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeled, and the iron gates were tangled with ivy. Rachel arrived at dusk, armed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and her phone. Lisa dropped her off, shouting encouragement as she drove away. Rachel smirked and stepped through the broken door. The inside of the manor was worse than she expected. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she explored the ground floor. The living room was filled with shattered furniture, and the kitchen sink was rusted beyond recognition. She noted it all on her phone, documenting her bravery for proof later. As night fell, Rachel set up her sleeping bag in the main hall, the largest room in the house. The fading sunlight cast long shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. She turned on her flashlight and sat down, scrolling through her phone to pass the time. Hours passed, uneventfully, and Rachel began to feel foolish. This place wasn't haunted, it was just a decaying old house. She decided to take one last look around before trying to sleep. Her footsteps echoed as she walked down the hallway, her flashlight illuminating faded wallpaper and old family portraits. At the end of the hall, she found a door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she discovered a small study. The room was cluttered with books and papers, and a heavy wooden desk sat in the center. Rachel's curiosity piqued as she noticed a journal lying open on the desk. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting neat but hurried. The last entry read, "They come at night. The whispers start first. Don't listen. Don't follow. Whatever you do, don't let them see you." A chill ran down Rachel's spine, but she brushed it off. It was probably some old resident's attempt at storytelling. She closed the journal and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment she thought she heard faint whispers. She froze, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. "Get a grip," she muttered, shaking her head. She reopened the door and returned to the main hall, her nerves frayed but her skepticism intact. Settling into her sleeping bag, she checked her phone. No signal. Typical. She sighed and closed her eyes, determined to get through the night. She woke to the sound of whispering. Rachel sat up, heart pounding. The whispers were soft, indistinct, and seemed to come from all around her. She shone her flashlight into the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could almost make out words, but not quite. She covered her ears, but the sound seemed to burrow into her head. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice trembling. The whispers ceased. For a moment there was only silence. Then, from the far end of the hall, she heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Rachel's breath caught. She shone her flashlight toward the noise, but saw only an empty hallway. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She scrambled to her feet, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of light cast by her flashlight. She squinted into the darkness, her hands trembling. Then she saw it. a faint outline of a figure just beyond the light's reach. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. Panic surged through Rachel. She bolted toward the door, but the air seemed heavy, her movements sluggish. Reaching the door, she yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. She turned back and the figure was closer, its form more distinct. It had no face, just an empty void where its features should be. Rachel screamed, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" she cried. The whispers crescendoed, the figure now mere feet away. In her desperation, she threw herself at the door and it finally gave way. She stumbled outside, collapsing onto the overgrown lawn. Comedy. The whispers stopped. The night was silent. Rachel didn't look back. She ran down the road until she reached the main street, where Lisa was waiting in her car, worried. Rachel didn't explain, didn't say a word. She got in and they drove away. Weeks later, Rachel tried to put the experience behind her, chalking it up to sleep deprivation and her imagination. But late at night, when she was alone, she sometimes heard faint whispers in the corners of her room. And when she checked her reflection, she swore she could see a faint, faceless figure standing just behind her. The Shadows of Crestwood Factory. Mark had always been fascinated by urban exploration. He loved delving into abandoned buildings, uncovering the remnants of lives long forgotten. His latest target was Crestwood Factory, an old textile mill that had been shuttered for nearly 50 years. Locals claimed the factory was cursed, but Mark dismissed the stories as nothing more than superstition. He arrived at the factory just before sunset, his backpack loaded with a flashlight, a camera, and a water bottle. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its shattered windows and crumbling facade a testament to decades of neglect. A rusted chain-link fence encircled the property, but Mark had already found a gap large enough to slip through. Once inside, he marveled at the eerie beauty of the decaying interior. Rows of rusting machinery sat silent and still, their purpose long forgotten. Faded posters hung on the walls, slogans like "Efficiency is key," barely legible beneath layers of grime. The air smelled of mildew and rust, and the only sounds were the creaking of the floorboards and the occasional drip of water. Mark began to explore, his camera clicking as he documented the scene. He moved deeper into the factory, finding a set of stairs that led to the basement. According to the blueprints he'd found online, this was where the storage rooms and employee break area had been. Intrigued, he descended into the darkness. The basement was colder, the air damp and oppressive. His flashlight revealed a labyrinth of narrow hallways lined with doors. Most were locked or led to empty rooms, but one door at the end of the hall caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and a faint flickering light spilled out from the gap. Mark hesitated. He wasn't alone. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. There was no response. Swallowing his nerves, he pushed the door open. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old desks and filing cabinets. In the center was a single bare bulb, swaying slightly as it cast harsh shadows on the walls. Mark's eyes were drawn to the far corner, where a stack of papers lay scattered across the floor. He picked one up and frowned. It was an employee record, the name and details blacked out with heavy ink. He flipped through more of the papers, finding similar redactions. Suddenly, he felt it, a shift in the air, like someone was standing behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. His flashlight beam danced over the walls, but nothing moved. Mark's heart raced. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. He decided to pack up and head back upstairs. As he turned to leave, the light bulb above him flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with his flashlight. When the beam finally cut through the gloom, the room looked different. The desks and cabinets were gone, replaced by rows of rusted machinery identical to those upstairs. The papers on the floor had vanished, and the air now carried the faint scent of oil and smoke. Mark backed toward the door, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He reached for the handle, but it was gone. The door frame was still there, but the door itself had been replaced by a solid wall. Panic surged through him as he banged on the wall, shouting for help. His voice echoed back, mocking him. The sound of machinery whirring to life froze him in place. The room was suddenly filled with the deafening clatter of looms and the hiss of steam. Mark turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the haze. Shadowy figures moved among the machines, their forms indistinct but human-like. They didn't seem to notice him, their movements mechanical and precise. "Yay!" he shouted, waving his flashlight. The figures didn't respond. Instead, one of them turned, revealing a face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head was smooth and featureless, as though it had been erased. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him, before taking a step closer. Mark stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The figures began to converge, their movements deliberate but unnervingly slow. He bolted, weaving through the maze of machinery. The sound of footsteps, more than his own, echoed behind him. Slowly, everywhere he looked, the sound. He ran blindly, the factory's layout twisting in ways that made no sense. Every turn led him back to the same room, the same machinery, the same faceless figures. His breathing was ragged, his legs aching, but he couldn't stop. He had to find a way out. Finally, he saw it, a staircase leading up. He sprinted toward it, the figures close behind. As he climbed, the air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting. He burst through a doorway and found himself outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a blessing. Mark didn't stop running until he reached his car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and peeled out of the parking lot without looking back. Only when he was miles away did he dare to glance in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Mark never spoke about what happened that night. He abandoned urban exploration altogether, but sometimes, late at night, he thought he could hear the distant hum of machinery and the faint, rhythmic steps of something that never stopped, following. Thank you for joining us on these chilling journeys into the unknown. Each story holds a reminder that fear isn't always about monsters in the dark. Sometimes, it's the shadows of our own reality. If you enjoyed these tales of suspense and terror, don't forget to hit that like button to let us know. Your support helps us keep creating more spine-tingling stories for you to enjoy. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a new upload. We've got even more thrilling adventures coming your way. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which story scared you the most? Do you have your own creepy experiences to share? Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Who knows, your story might inspire our next video. Stay tuned for more, because with your support, we can bring you these dark tales even more often. Until next time, stay curious and keep your lights on. See you in the next story.